Lanciano, Italy. The year is 700 AD. The stone floors of the Church of St. Lagontian are cold enough to numb the feet. Outside, the world is quiet. Inside, a Bosilian monk stands at the altar, his hands trembling. He is not trembling from the cold, but from the silence of God. He is a man of the cloth, yet his heart is empty. He recites the Latin prayers, but they taste like ash in his mouth. He is begging for a sign, anything to prove that he isn't speaking to an empty room. He whispers the words of consecration, Hoc estatinum corpus meum. And then the terror begins. He didn't ask for a miracle. He asked for an answer. And what he received was a biological sample that would terrify the World Health Organization 1,200 years later. But before we get to what happened, we need to understand who this man was. Not his name. History didn't preserve that. What we know is his condition, his spiritual diagnosis. He was suffering from the one disease that no monastery could cure, intellectual doubt. Not the kind of doubt that comes from wickedness or rebellion. The kind that comes from thinking too much. From asking questions that have no answers. From standing at an altar every single morning and wondering if the ritual means anything at all. Imagine that existence. You wake before dawn in a stone cell barely wide enough to lie down in. The walls are damp. The air smells like mildew and old incense. You wash your face in water so cold it feels like needles. You put on the same rough wool habit you wore yesterday, and the day before and the day before that. The fabric shaves your shoulders. Your sandals are worn through at the heel. Your knees ache from kneeling on stone. And then you walk down the corridor to the chapel. Your footsteps echo in the darkness. You light the candles. You range the vessels. The chalice is tarnished silver, cold to the touch. The paten holds a piece of unleavened bread, round and pale, smelling faintly of wheat and nothing else. The wine is dark, almost black in the dim light. It sloshes gently when you pour it. Just wine. Just bread. Just objects. You begin the Mass. You say the words you've said 1,000 times. In tribo adulter Dei. I will go to the altar of God. But you don't feel like you're going anywhere. You feel like you're standing still in an empty room, reciting syllables to the wall. The Latin flows automatically. Your mouth knows the shapes. Your tongue knows the rhythms. But your mind is somewhere else. Your mind is asking the question you're not allowed to ask. What if none of this is real? What if the consecration is just theater? What if the moment you pronounce the words of institution, when you say, "This is my body, this is my blood," nothing actually happens? What if the bread remains bread? What if the wine remains wine? What if you're holding props, not sacraments? What if you're an actor in a costume, performing for an audience of one yourself in a play that has no author? This is the anatomy of doubt, not the loud, defiant atheism of the modern age, not the smug certainty that God doesn't exist. This is the quiet, suffocating uncertainty of a man who has devoted his entire life to a proposition he can no longer verify. A man who has sacrificed everything: comfort, family, wealth, freedom for a belief that might be nothing more than a beautiful lie. And the worst part, he can't leave. He can't walk away, because leaving would mean admitting that he wasted his life, that every prayer was noise, that every sacrifice was for nothing. So he stays. He performs the ritual. He goes through the motions. He becomes a machine that produces religious output with no internal conviction, hollow, mechanical, dead inside. This is where we find him on that morning in the year 700, standing at the altar in Lanciano, going through the routine, his mind screaming at the silence. He elevates the host. He recites the formula, hoc estate enim corpus meum. This is my body. The words hang in the air like smoke. He waits. Nothing happens. It never does. Except this time, something does. Let's pause here. Let's focus on the ordinary before the extraordinary. Because what makes the event so disturbing is not just what happened, but the fact that it interrupted the absolute mundanity of the ritual. The Mass is repetition. It is the same words, the same gestures, the same objects, every single day. That's the point. The liturgy is designed to be a groove worn into time. You step into it and let it carry you. You don't think. You enact. The bread. Let's talk about the bread. Unleavened, as prescribed by tradition. Flour and water, kneaded and baked. It has a specific texture. Slightly grainy. Dry enough to snap when you break it. Light enough to dissolve on your tongue. It tastes like nothing. It's not meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to be functional. A vehicle, a symbol. It sits on the pattern, a flat circular wafer about the size of a coin, pale cream in color, ordinary. Forgettable. The wine dark red, almost purple. It catches the candlelight. It has a slight vinegary edge, the way wine does when it's been sitting in a cool stone cellar for months. It's heavier than water. You can feel the weight of it when you lift the chalice. It moves slowly, coating the sides of the cup. There's a faint aroma of fermented grapes and oak. Nothing more. It's wine. It behaves like wine. It looks like wine. Because it is wine. The monk holds the bread between his thumb and forefinger. He can feel the dryness of it, the fragility. If he presses too hard, it will crumble. He raises it above his head, facing the altar, his back to the congregation. If there even is a congregation. Sometimes there's no one. Sometimes he's alone. Just him and the stone, and the candles and the cold. He speaks the words, hoc estate enim corpus meum, for this is my body. His voice is flat, exhausted. He's said these words so many times they've lost all meaning. They're just sounds, syllables ranged in a pattern. He doesn't expect anything. He's not even really praying. He's just completing the task. Like washing dishes. Like sweeping the floor. Mechanical. Necessary. Empty. And then his hand feels something change. Not a spiritual sensation, not a feeling of warmth or light or peace, a physical sensation. The texture under his fingers shifts. The dry, brittle wafer becomes something else, something softer. Something moist. He looks down. It is no longer bread. The circular host has transformed into a thick, irregular piece of tissue. Fibrous. Muscular. The color has darkened from pale cream to deep red-brown, the color of organ meat. The surface glistens slightly, as if freshly cut. He can see striations in the tissue, parallel lines running through it like the grain in meat. It has weight now. Real weight. The kind of weight that comes from density, from water content, from the mass of living cells. He doesn't drop it, he can't. His fingers are frozen. His entire body has locked. His breath catches in his throat. There's a moment of absolute cognitive dissonance, where his brain is trying to reconcile what he's seeing with what should be there. The object in his hand does not match the object he picked up 30 seconds ago. The laws of matter have been violated. The physical constants of the universe have glitched. He looks at the chalice. The wine is coagulating. No longer liquid, clotting. forming into 5 distinct masses, separating from the remaining fluid-like blood cells precipitating out of plasma. The surface of the liquid is no longer smooth. It's lumpy, uneven. The color has shifted from dark red to something brown, something oxidized, something that looks less like wine and more like blood that's been exposed to air. The monk makes a sound. Not a word, a sound. Something between a gasp and a choke. His legs are shaking. He wants to put it down. He wants to walk away. He wants to pretend this isn't happening. But he can't. Because it is happening. The evidence is in his hand, warm, pulsing slightly. Or is that just his own trembling? He can't tell. He can't think. His mind is a white noise of panic. This is not ecstasy. This is not the moment of mystical union that saints write poetry about. This is biological horror. This is the sudden, violent intrusion of the physical into the metaphysical. The spiritual made flesh in the most literal, most visceral way possible. He is holding a piece of muscle tissue, in a church, in his hand. And he has no explanation, no framework, no category for this experience. He sets it down on the pattern with shaking hands. The tissue settles with a soft, wet sound, not the dry tap of bread, a thud. The sound of matter. He backs away from the altar. His mind is screaming at him to run, but his training holds him in place. You don't abandon the Eucharist. You don't leave the altar mid-mass. Even if the world is ending. Even if reality itself is collapsing. But this is worse than the world ending. This is the world becoming too real, too immediate, too undeniable. He covers his face with his hands. Is he crying? Is he praying? Is he trying to unsee what he just saw? We don't know. The historical record is silent on his internal state. What we know is that he called for witnesses. He didn't hide it. He didn't destroy it. He showed it to the other monks, to the bishop, to anyone who would look. And they saw what he saw, flesh, blood. Not symbols. Not metaphors. The actual substances. And then the decision. What do you do with something like this? You can't consume it. You can't throw it away. You can't pretend it didn't happen. So you preserve it. You put it in a reliquary. You build a case round it. You document it. You make it public. You turn the moment of terror into an object of veneration. But the terror remains. Underneath the gold and the glass, there is still the memory of that morning. The moment when the routine broke. When the cosmos blinked. The teens centuries later, the flesh is still there. In the church of San Francesco in Lanciano, in a broke monstrance of silver and gold, there sits a piece of brown, fibrous tissue roughly the size of a coin. Next to it, in a crystal chalice, are 5 dark, irregular clots. They are not embalmed. They are not treated with chemicals. They are not frozen. They are exposed to air, to humidity, to the fluctuations of temperature that come with being in a building that has no climate control. And they have not decayed. They have not dissolved. They have not turned to dust. In 1971, a professor of anatomy named Odoardo Linoli was asked by the church to examine the relic. He was a man of science, skeptical by training, methodical by temperament. He took samples. He subjected them to every test available in modern pathology. Microscopy, chromatography, immunological analysis. He expected to find medieval bread, preserved wine, maybe some kind of organic compound that had fossilized over time. What he found was myocardial tissue, hard muscle, human hard muscle, with the structural integrity of tissue that had been removed from a living body and preserved within hours. The cells were intact. The nuclei were visible under the microscope. The blood was AB positive, the rarest blood type, found in less than 3% of the human population. And it was male. XY chromosomes. A man's heart. He published his findings in a medical journal. Not a religious publication, a scientific one. Because what he discovered was not theology. It was biology. Measurable. Verifiable, physical. But here's what haunts the rational mind. If this is an 8th century relic, how is the tissue still intact? How are the cells still organized? How is the DNA still readable? Tissue degrades, especially tissue that's been sitting in a church for over 1,000 years, exposed to candles, incense, human breath, bacteria, fungi, temperature fluctuations, humidity. It should be dust. It should be unrecognizable. But it's not. If it's a forgery, when was it made? The church records go back to the 8th century. The relic has been documented continuously for 1,300 years. Carbon dating is useless because the sample is in a reliquary that's been touched by countless people, contaminating any potential dating. But even if you could date it, what would that tell you? That it's old. We already know it's old. The question isn't when. The question is how. How is it preserved? How is it still organized at the cellular level? How does it retain the structure of myocardial tissue after more than a millennium? These are not rhetorical questions. These are scientific problems that have no good answers. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the relic exists not to provide answers, but to generate questions. To sit in its glass case in Lanciano and force you to choose. Do you believe your eyes or your worldview? Do you trust the data or your assumptions about what's possible? Do you accept the anomaly or dismiss it as fraud despite the evidence? The monk didn't get closure. History doesn't record whether his doubt was resolved or deepened. Whether he spent the rest of his life in awe or terror. Whether he ever performed the Mass again without his hands shaking. We don't even know his name. He's been erased by time, reduced to a single moment. The moment when he asked for proof and received it in a form he couldn't process. And now, 13 centuries later, the proof is still there, waiting, in a church in central Italy, a piece of human cardiac muscle, coagulated blood, suspended in glass, defying decomposition, defying explanation, defying the comfortable distance we like to maintain between the material and the miraculous. You can go there. You can see it. It's not hidden. It's not secret. It's on display. Millions of people have stood in front of that monstrance and looked at the brown, fibrous mass and tried to reconcile what they're seeing with what they know about the world. And most of them walk away more unsettled than when they arrived. Because it doesn't look holy. It looks biological. It looks like something that belongs in a morgue, not a church. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. Not that it exists, but that it exists in the wrong category. It violates the boundaries we've built between science and religion, between matter and spirit, between the explainable and the inexplicable. It refuses to stay in its lane. It insists on being both. A relic and a specimen. A miracle and a medical anomaly. A sign from God and a challenge to reason. The monk stood at the altar and asked the universe for evidence. And the universe answered. Not with a vision, not with a voice, not with a feeling of peace or certainty, but with flesh.raw, undeniable.physical. The kind of evidence that doesn't comfort you. The kind that keeps you awake at night. The kind that makes you question not just what you believe, but what you know. And it's still there, still waiting, still refusing to decay, still asking the same question it asked in 700 AD. What if the impossible is just the word we use for things we don't understand yet? What if the gap between the spiritual and the material is narrower than we think? What if the answer to doubt isn't certainty, but evidence so strange that it creates more doubt than it resolves? The flesh of Lanciano doesn't prove anything. It just exists, and its existence is enough to break the categories we use to make sense of the world. Put a piece of raw meat on your kitchen counter. In 24 hours, it begins to smell. In 3 days, the bacteria have taken hold. In a week, it is putrid. In a month, it is dust. This is the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. Order collapsing into chaos. Nature has a strict rule. Dead things do not stay fresh. But in the Abruzzo region of Italy, there is a rebellion against this law. For 12 centuries, 5 clots of blood and a circle of cardiac tissue have sat exposed to the air. No vacuum seal. No preservatives. No embalming fluid. By all laws of organic chemistry. This flesh should have vanished by the year 850 AD. Why is it still here? Let's start with what should have happened. Let's talk about the science of rot. When living tissue dies, a process called autolysis begins immediately. Within minutes, the cells can no longer maintain their internal chemistry. Enzymes that were carefully controlled during life suddenly have no regulation. They start breaking down the cell walls from the inside. It's called self-digestion. The tissue literally eats itself at the molecular level. Then comes putrefaction. This is when the bacteria arrive. And they're everywhere. On your skin, in the air, on every surface. The average cubic meter of air contains between 100,000 and 1 million bacteria. The moment tissue is exposed, they colonize it. They feed on the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates. They multiply exponentially. 1 bacterium becomes 2, 2 become 4, 4 become 8. Within hours, there are millions. Within days, billions. These bacteria produce gases, hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia. The tissue swells. It changes color from red to green to black. The smell becomes overwhelming. The structure breaks down. What was once organized muscle fiber becomes a liquefied mass, and eventually, when all the organic material has been consumed, all that's left is dry residue, dust, the complete dissolution of biological order. This process is unavoidable. It's not a matter of if, but when. The speed depends on temperature, humidity, and oxygen availability in warm, moist conditions. A piece of hard tissue would be unrecognizable within a week in cooler, drier conditions. Maybe a month, but the end point is the same: decomposition, disintegration, return to elemental components. Now let's look at what we have in Lanciano. A piece of myocardial tissue, roughly circular, approximately 5 centimeters in diameter, and 5 clots of coagulated blood, each one irregular in shape, varying in size. They sit in a glass and crystal monstrance, a religious display case. The glass is not hermetically sealed. It's not airtight. There are gaps where the metal frame meets the glass. Air circulates. Humidity enters. Oxygen is present. Every condition necessary for decomposition is met. And yet the tissue remains, not fossilized, not mummified, not dried to the point of becoming brittle leather. The tissue retains its fibrous structure. The blood clots maintain their distinct shape. They haven't fused into a single mass. They haven't crumbled. They haven't liquefied. They sit there, separate and intact, as if they were removed from a body yesterday. 1200 years, let's put that in perspective, in 700 AD. When this event allegedly occurred, the Byzantine Empire was at its height. The Tang dynasty ruled China. The Islamic Caliphate was expanding across North Africa. There was no Italy as we know it. No unified nation, just a collection of feudal territories, constantly at war, constantly invaded, constantly changing hands. The relic sat through the Dark Ages, through the medieval period, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through 2 world wars, through 12 centuries of human history. Political upheaval, religious reformation, scientific revolution, and through all of it. This piece of tissue remained biologically stable. Think about the environmental conditions it endured. Central Italy has hot summers. Temperatures regularly exceed 30 degrees Celsius. That's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside a stone church with no air conditioning, with candles burning constantly, the temperature would be even higher. Heat accelerates bacterial growth. Heat speeds decomposition. Every summer for 12 centuries, this tissue was subjected to conditions that should have reduced it to liquid. Then there are the winters, cold, damp, sometimes freezing. Stone buildings retain moisture. Humidity condenses on the walls. Mold grows in the corners, every winter for 12 centuries. This tissue was exposed to conditions that promote fungal colonization, and yet there's no evidence of mold, no visible fungal growth, no degradation from moisture damage. And it wasn't just sitting peacefully in a climate-controlled museum. The history of Lanciano is violent. In 1074, the church was destroyed during a Norman invasion. The relic was moved. In 1258, it was moved again to protect it from another conflict. In 1566, the Turks invaded the Abruzzo coast. The relic was hidden. Each time it was moved, it was exposed to new environments, new bacteria, new risks of contamination. In 1672, the Franciscans took possession of the relic and placed it in the current monstrance. But even that wasn't the end of its journey. In 1920, the church underwent major renovations. The relic was temporarily relocated. In 1971, it was removed for scientific testing. Samples were taken. The tissue was handled, measured, photographed under laboratory conditions. And then it was returned to the display case where it sits today. Every time the relic was moved, every time it was touched, every time it was exposed to new air, new hands, new environments, it should have degraded. Every relocation was an opportunity for a contamination. Every opening of the case was an introduction of new bacterial populations, and yet the decomposition never occurred. Let's compare this to other famous examples of preserved bodies. The Egyptian mummies, the most iconic examples of human preservation. The Egyptians developed an elaborate process of mummification that took 70 days. They removed the internal organs. They dried the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt. They wrapped it in linen soaked in resin. They sealed it in multiple coffins and placed it in a tomb designed to be airtight and dry. Even with all of that preparation, with every possible precaution to prevent decomposition, many mummies still degraded. Many were damaged by moisture, by insects, by bacteria that managed to find their way past the seals, and these were bodies that had been intentionally preserved using the most advanced techniques of their time. Full bodies, not just a piece of tissue. The Lanciano flesh received no such treatment. It was not embalmed. It was not dried with salts. It was not wrapped. It was not sealed in an airtight container. It was placed in a glass case with gaps for air to enter. And it wasn't a full body with skin to act as a protective barrier. It was exposed tissue, muscle and blood, the most vulnerable forms of organic matter, the first to decompose in any normal circumstances. Or consider the bog bodies of northern Europe, bodies preserved in peat bogs for thousands of years. The preservation happens because the bog water is acidic, oxygen poor and cold. The specific chemistry of the bog prevents bacterial growth. The bodies are essentially pickled. But even then, they are not perfectly preserved. The skin turns brown and leathery. The bones soften. The internal organs often liquefy. And this is with the benefit of a natural preservation environment. The Lanciano tissue had no such benefit. It sat in normal atmospheric conditions, room temperature, normal oxygen levels, no acidic water, no special chemistry. Nothing that would explain its survival according to known preservation methods. Then there are the incorruptibles. The bodies of saints that allegedly did not decompose after death. Saint Bernadette Saubarus in France. Saint Catherine of Bologna in Italy. Saint Cecilia in Rome. But even these bodies required intervention. They were placed in sealed coffins. Some were treated with lime or other preservatives, even if the church didn't officially acknowledge it. Some were wax-coated or reconstructed. And there's always debate about how much of the preservation is natural versus how much was aided by human intervention. But the Lanciano flesh has been analyzed multiple times by multiple scientists. There is no evidence of chemical treatment, no preservatives, no wax, no coating, no drying agents. The tissue is simply tissue, exposed and enduring. In 1574, the Archbishop of Lanciano ordered an official investigation. He documented the relic's condition. He testified that it showed no signs of decay despite being 3 centuries old at that time. Think about that. Even in 1574, people recognized that the survival of this tissue was anomalous. They knew enough about decomposition to understand that this shouldn't be possible. In 1970, the Church authorized the first modern scientific examination, not because they doubted the relic, but because they wanted documentation. They wanted to know what exactly they had been preserving for 12 centuries. They wanted data. Professor Odoardo Linoli was chosen for the task. He was a professor of anatomy and pathological histology at the University of Siena, a scientist, not a theologian. He approached the relic with the same methodology he would use on any biological specimen. He took samples. He prepared slides. He examined them under microscopy. He subjected them to chemical analysis. He treated it as a medical specimen, not a holy object. His mandate was simple: determine the nature of the tissue, identify its origin, assess its condition, explain, if possible, how it had been preserved, standard forensic procedure. The kind of analysis performed on tissue samples every day in pathology labs around the world. But before we get to what he found, we need to understand what he was looking at. Not a fresh sample, not a recently preserved specimen, but tissue that had been exposed to air, light, temperature fluctuations, and human handling for over 1,000 years, tissue that had survived invasions, relocations, renovations, and the simple passage of time. Every year that passed was another year that decomposition should have advanced. Every decade was another opportunity for bacteria to colonize. Every century was another layer of impossibility. By the time Linoli examined it in 1971, the tissue had survived 1,271 years, 12 centuries and 7 decades, longer than the lifespan of empires, longer than the existence of the scientific method itself. During those 12 centuries, the world changed completely. In 700 AD, people believed disease was caused by bad air. They thought the earth was the center of the universe. They had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of cellular biology, no framework for comprehending what they were looking at. By 1971, we had electron microscopes. We understood DNA. We could analyze tissue at the molecular level. We could identify proteins, map chromosomes, determine blood types. We had all the tools of modern science. And those tools were about to be applied to an object that should not exist. The relic had survived the ignorance of the Dark Ages. It had survived the plague, which killed millions across Europe in the 14th century. It had survived the scientific revolution. When empiricism replaced superstition, it had survived into the age of rationalism, into the age of skepticism, into the age where nothing is accepted without evidence. And now it was time to provide that evidence. Not through faith, not through tradition, not through the testimony of monks who claimed to have witnessed a miracle, but through microscopy, through chromatography, through immunological analysis, through every test that modern medicine could devise. The tissue that had defied nature for 12 centuries was about to face something it had never encountered before. The scientific method, the demand for objective, measurable, repeatable results, the requirement to submit to scrutiny, to testing, to the cold logic of empirical investigation. Would it survive this new test? Would the microscope reveal what the centuries had hidden? Or would it simply confirm what everyone already suspected, that this tissue had no business existing, that its preservation violated every known law of organic chemistry, that its survival was, by definition, impossible? The relic had endured history. Now it had to endure science. And science doesn't accept mysteries. Science demands explanations. Science requires answers, even when those answers challenge everything we think we know about the universe. For 12 centuries, the flesh of Lanciano sat in its glass case, silent and inscrutable, waiting for someone to ask not just what it was, but how it continued to be. Waiting for the technology to catch up with the question. Waiting for the moment when belief would meet evidence, when faith would face data, when the ancient and the modern would collide in a laboratory in Italy. That moment arrived in 1970, and what Professor Linoli discovered when he placed the tissue under a microscope would raise more questions than it answered. Questions about preservation, questions about origin, questions about what's possible in a universe we thought we understood. But those answers, those impossible, unsettling, paradigm-challenging answers would have to wait for the autopsy. Faith usually demands that we close our eyes. Science demands that we open them. In 1970, the Catholic Church made a gamble that should have destroyed the legend of Lanciano. They didn't call a priest. They called a pathologist. Dr. Odoardo Linoli, a head of service at the hospital of Arezzo, was given a task that sounded like madness. Here is a piece of bread from the 8th century. Tell us if it's human. Linoli expected to find starch, mold, or perhaps the dried muscle of a pig used to fake a miracle. Instead, on March 4, 1971, he published a report that didn't just confirm the legend. It terrified the skeptics, because the microscope didn't just see flesh. It saw a left ventricle that had been tortured. Let's establish the parameters of the investigation. This was not a theological inquiry. This was a medical examination conducted under the same protocols used in any pathology lab. Doctor Odoardo Linoli was not a man of faith assignment. He was a professor of anatomy, pathological histology, and chemistry. His credentials included serving as the director of the hospital laboratory in Arezzo and teaching at the University of Siena. His job was to analyze tissue samples, identify their origin, document their condition. He had done this thousands of times. Biopsies from living patients, samples from cadavers, specimens from autopsies. This was routine work. Except the sample he received in November 1970 was not routine. It was 12 centuries old. It had been sitting in a church reliquary, exposed to air, handled by countless people, subjected to temperature fluctuations, humidity, candlelight, incense smoke, and the normal atmospheric conditions of a medieval stone building. By every standard of tissue preservation, it should have been unusable, degraded beyond recognition, a dried husk with no cellular structure remaining. Linoli's first step was documentation. He photographed the relic in its monstrance. He measured it. The flesh portion was roughly circular, approximately 4.8 centimeters in diameter and 0.5 centimeters thick. Brown in color, fibrous in texture. The 5 blood clots varied in size, the largest approximately 2 centimeters, the smallest less than 1 centimeter. They were dark brown, almost black, irregular in shape, and appeared to be coagulated masses rather than liquid. Then came the sampling. Using sterile instruments, Linoli extracted small portions of both the flesh and the blood clots. This required permission from church authorities, as he was removing material from a sacred relic, but the church had authorized the investigation, specifically to obtain scientific answers. They wanted to know what they had been preserving for. Over a millennium, the samples were prepared using standard histological techniques. The insections were cut and mounted on glass slides. Some were stained with hematoxylin and eosin, the most common stain used to visualize tissue structure under a microscope. Others were prepared for immunological testing. Others for a chemical analysis. Linoli approached this with the same methodology he would use for any unknown biological sample. No special treatment. No assumptions. Just standard laboratory procedure. When he placed the first slide under the microscope, he expected to see degraded cellular debris, amorphous organic material, perhaps some recognizable structures if he was lucky, but mostly breakdown products. Tissue that had been dead for 12 centuries doesn't maintain it. Architecture. The cells collapse, the membranes dissolve, the proteins denature. You get her. Biological smear, not organized tissue. What Linoli saw was myocardium, hard muscle tissue, not degraded, not amorphous, structured, organized, with clearly visible cellular components. The muscle fibers were arranged in the characteristic branching pattern of cardiac tissue. The striations were visible, the alternating light and dark bands that give heart muscle its distinctive appearance under magnification. The nuclei of the cells were intact, oval, centrally located within the fibers, exactly where they should be in living cardiac tissue. This was not possible. Cellular structure degrades within days of death, even under ideal preservation conditions. The cell membranes break down. The organelles disperse. The nuclei fragment. You lose the architectural organization. And this wasn't tissue that had been preserved under ideal conditions. This had been sitting in a church for over 1,000 years. And yet here, under the microscope, was tissue that looked like it had been removed from a human heart and preserved within hours, not centuries. Linoli performed multiple staining techniques to confirm his findings. Different stains highlight different cellular components. Masson's trichrum stain to visualize collagen and muscle fibers. Periodic acid shift stain to detect carbohydrates. Van Giesen's stain for connective tissue. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. This was cardiac muscle, human cardiac muscle, with preserved cellular architecture that should not exist in tissue this old. But Linoli went further. He didn't just identify it as heart tissue. He identified which part of the heart. The myocardium has different characteristics depending on its location. The atrial walls are thinner. The ventricular walls are thicker, more muscular, designed to pump blood with greater force. By examining the thickness of the tissue, the density of the muscle fibers, and the presence of specific structures, Linoli determined that this was ventricular myocardium. The thick, muscular wall of one of the heart's pumping chambers. And he identified something else, something that would become central to the interpretation of this relic. He found evidence of infiltration in the tissue, not bacterial infiltration, not fungal, but infiltration consistent with trauma, with stress, with what pathologists call agonal. Changes the cellular modifications that occur in tissue subjected to extreme physiological stress. Before death, within the myocardial tissue, Linoli identified fragments of the vagus nerve. This is significant. The vagus nerve is part of the autonomic nervous system. It innervates the heart, controlling heart rate and rhythm. Its presence in the sample confirms that this is not just any piece of heart tissue, but tissue that includes the nerve supply. And the condition of this nerve tissue suggested that it had been subjected to significant stress. The kind of stress associated with trauma, suffocation, or extreme physical duress. Let me be specific about what this means in pathological terms. When a person dies under traumatic circumstances, suffocation, crucifixion. Severe physical trauma, the tissues show characteristic changes. The cells undergo stress. Responses. There's an increase in certain proteins. The cellular architecture shows signs of hypoxia. Oxygen deprivation. The tissues look different under a microscope compared to tissue from someone who died peacefully. Linoli documented these changes. He noted the presence of inflammatory markers. The tissue wasn't just heart tissue from a healthy organ removed post-mortem. It was heart tissue from an organ that had undergone significant physiological stress before death, an organ that had been starved of oxygen, an organ that had been subjected to trauma. This wasn't in the medieval legend. The story from 700 AD simply said the bread turned to flesh. It didn't describe a tortured heart. It didn't mention a death by asphyxiation. But the microscope saw it. The cellular architecture preserved the evidence of how this person died. Not peacefully, not quietly, but under extreme duress. The kind of duress consistent with crucifixion, where death comes slowly from asphyxiation as the body can no longer support itself to breathe. Then came the blood analysis. The 5 clots were subjected to similar scrutiny. Linoli dissolved samples in saline solution and examined them under microscopy. He found red blood cells, not the ghosts of red blood cells, not the residue or chemical signature of blood that once existed. Actual intact red blood cells, with visible cell membranes, with the characteristic big concave disc shape. Human red blood cells, identifiable and organized. This is not how blood behaves after 12 centuries. Red blood cells are fragile. They have a lifespan of about 120 days in the living body. After death, they break down rapidly. The membranes rupture. The hemoglobin leaks out. Within weeks, you lose the cellular structure. What remains is hemoglobin residue, iron deposits, chemical signatures of blood. But not intact cells. Never intact cells, especially not after 1,000 years. Linoli performed immunological testing to determine blood type. He used anti-sera-containing antibodies for our antigens, B antigens, and our H factor. The test is simple. You add the anti-serum to a blood sample if the corresponding antigen is present. The blood cells clump together agglutination. If it's absent, they remain dispersed. The blood from the Lanciano clots reacted with both anti- and anti-B anti-sera. Agglutination in both tests, and it reacted with anti-H anti-serum, positive result. This meant the blood type was A positive, the universal receiver, the rarest blood type in the human population. Less than 3% of people carry this genetic signature. A positive is significant not just because it's rare, but because of what it represents genetically. Blood type is inherited. The A and B antigens are produced by genes inherited from your parents. To have both A and B antigens, you must have inherited both genetic variants. AB is a recessive expression, a biological compromise between two genetic instructions. It's uncommon because it requires a specific combination of parental genetics. The fact that this blood was A positive meant that whoever this tissue came from was part of a very small genetic minority. If you were trying to fake a miracle using animal blood or blood from a common medieval source, the odds of randomly selecting a positive blood are less than 3 in 100. And that's assuming you had access to blood typing in the 8th century, which you didn't. Blood types weren't discovered until 1901 by Karl Landsteiner. But Linoli didn't stop there. He performed serum protein fractionation. This is a test that separates the different proteins in blood serum. Blood contains multiple protein fractions, albumin, globulins, fibrinogen. These proteins have different weights and charges, so they can be separated using electrophoresis, a technique that pulls charged molecules through a gel using an electric field. Different proteins migrate at different speeds, creating a pattern of bands that can be analyzed. When Linoli performed this test on the Lanciano blood, he found something that should not exist. The protein fractions matched the profile of fresh human blood. Not degraded blood, not ancient blood where the proteins had broken down into smaller fragments. Fresh blood. The albumin fraction was intact. The globulin fractions were present in normal proportions. The pattern looked like a sample that had been drawn from a living human being within days, not centuries. Proteins degrade over time. They denature. They break apart. The bonds that hold them together are not stable over geological timescales, even under ideal storage conditions frozen. In a controlled laboratory environment, proteins begin to fragment within years. The idea that proteins could remain intact and organized for 12 centuries in a glass case, at room temperature, is biochemically absurd. And yet the electrophoresis didn't lie. The test is objective. You separate the proteins. You measure their migration patterns. You compare them to known standards. The data doesn't care about impossibility. It just reports what's there. And what was there was a protein profile consistent with living human blood. Linoli published his findings in a detailed medical report. Not in a religious journal. Not in a theological publication. In a scientific document that detailed his methodology, presented his data, and drew conclusions based solely on the empirical evidence. His report included photomicrographs images taken through the microscope showing the cellular structure, chemical analysis results, blood typing data, protein fractionation patterns. Everything documented according to standard medical reporting practices. His conclusion was stated in the language of pathology, dry and precise. The flesh is real flesh, the blood is real blood. The flesh consists of muscular tissue of the heart. specifically the myocardium of the left ventricle. The blood type is AB positive. The proteins are those of normal human blood serum. The preservation is unexplained by current scientific understanding. That last sentence is critical. Linoli did not say it was a miracle. He did not invoke divine intervention. He stated a fact. The preservation cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. That's the language of a scientist confronted with an anomaly. Not denial, not dismissal, acknowledgement. That the data does not fit the model. The report circulated within the medical community. In 1973, the World Health Organization and the United Nations requested access to the data, not because they wanted to validate a religious miracle, but because they wanted to understand the preservation mechanism. If tissue could be preserved for 12 centuries without chemical treatment, without refrigeration, without any known preservation method, that had medical implications. That was a technology that didn't exist. That was knowledge worth investigating. A second commission was formed. Dr. Linoli's findings were reviewed by additional pathologists, including Professor Ruggero Bertelli of the University of Siena. The samples were re-examined. Additional tests were performed, and every test confirmed Linoli's original findings: myocardial tissue, AB-positive blood, preserved cellular structure, intact proteins, no evidence of artificial preservation, no chemical treatment, no explanation for its survival. In the official WHO report, the conclusion was even more direct. Science, aware of its limitations, must admit its inability to provide an explanation for this phenomenon. That's not a statement of faith. That's a statement of scientific humility. An acknowledgement that the data exists, the data is verifiable, but the data does not conform to any known natural process. The tissue exists, the blood exists, the cellular structure exists, the proteins exist, and none of it should. Let's talk about what this means in forensic terms. When you find biological evidence that contradicts your understanding of how biology works, you have three options. First, you can dismiss the evidence as contaminated or misidentified, but Linoli used standard laboratory procedures. His methodology was sound. His results were replicated by independent researchers. The tissue is what he said it is. Second, you can propose an unknown preservation mechanism. Some natural process that we haven't discovered yet. Some chemical reaction in the atmosphere of the church. Some bacterial colony that produces preservative compounds. Some interaction between the glass and the tissue that creates a protective environment. But no such mechanism has been found. The tissue has been in that reliquary since 1672. Before that, it was in different containers. The preservation predates the current storage conditions. Third, you can accept that you're dealing with an anomaly, a data point that exists outside your current model of reality, something that is real, measurable, and inexplicable. That's where the evidence points, not toward fraud, not toward misidentification, not toward unknown natural processes, but toward something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of biochemistry, and yet does. The tissue tells a story, not through words, but through its cellular structure. It tells the story of a human heart subjected to extreme trauma, a heart that stopped beating under conditions of asphyxiation and physical stress, a heart that was removed from a body and preserved in a way that defies natural law. A heart that has sat in a church for 12 centuries, waiting for the technology to exist that could read its message. And the message is this: I am real. I am human. I am impossibly preserved. I am evidence of something that shouldn't be possible. And I'm still here. Dr. Linoli didn't solve the mystery. He documented it. He took an object of faith and subjected it to the tools of science, and science confirmed what faith had claimed. The tissue is real. The blood is real. The preservation is real. What science could not confirm what science explicitly stated it cannot explain is how this preservation occurred. That gap between confirmation and explanation is where the mystery lives. The data is solid. The methodology is sound. The results are reproducible. But the mechanism is absent. The how is missing. And in that absence, in that gap where science stops and something else begins, that's where the question remains. Not is it real, but how is it real? Not does it exist, but why does it exist? Not can we prove it's human tissue, but can we explain why human tissue from the 8th century is still biologically intact in a way that violates every known law of decomposition? The autopsy is complete. The evidence is documented. The data is published. The world now knows exactly what the flesh of Lanciano is. What the world does not know, what science admits it cannot know, is how it continues to be. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the purpose of this tissue is not to provide answers, but to prove that there are questions science cannot yet answer. To exist as physical evidence of the limits of our understanding. To sit in a glass case in Italy, measurable and real and impossible, forcing anyone who looks at it to choose between dismissing the data or expanding the model. The microscopes were heart, a human heart, a tortured heart, a heart that stopped beating 2,000 years ago under conditions of extreme trauma. And somehow, impossibly, that heart is still here, still intact, still waiting. Still asking the question that neither faith nor science can fully answer. What if the impossible is just the word we use for things we don't understand yet? In the world of hematology, there is a specific blood type known as the universal receiver, type AB positive. It is the rarest blood type in the world, found in less than 3% of the human population. It is a biological anomaly of blood that can accept life from anyone, but can only give to its own kind. When Linoli tested the 8th century flesh in Lanciano, the result was AB positive. When scientists tested the shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of a crucified man, the result was AB positive. When they tested the sudarium of Oviedo, the face cloth from the 7th century, the result was AB positive. 3 artifacts, 3 centuries, 1 blood. The question is no longer what is it. The question is, who does this DNA belong to? Let's talk about what makes AB positive blood so unusual. In the grand lottery of human genetics, your blood type is determined by the proteins that exist on the surface of your red blood cells. Type A has O antigens. Type B has B antigens. Type O has neither. But type AB has both. It is a biological compromise, a merger of 2 separate genetic instructions. And then there's their each factor, positive or negative, another layer of complexity. AB positive means you have their antigen, the B antigen, and they are each protein. You are genetically equipped to accept any blood type in a transfusion. You are the universal receiver. But here's the paradox. While you can receive from anyone, you can only donate to others with AB positive blood. You can take, but you cannot give broadly. For a figure who, according to theology, gave his blood for all humanity, the irony is almost poetic. Only 3% of the global population has this blood type. In some regions, it's even rarer. Less than 1% in certain parts of Asia. Between 3 and 5% in Europe. It is not the blood of the common man. It is statistically exceptional. So when Dr. Odoardo Linoli discovered in 1971 that the flesh of Lanciano was A positive. He wasn't just identifying a blood type. He was identifying an anomaly within an anomaly. Ancient tissue, preserved against all biological laws, belonging to the rarest genetic category. But Lanciano is not alone, and this is where the story becomes something else entirely. This is where we move from a single mystery to a pattern. Because the same blood type has appeared into other artifacts, both connected to the same historical figure, both defying the same laws of preservation. The Shroud of Turin. You've heard of it. A 14-foot linen cloth that bears the faint image of a crucified man. The image shows wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion. Nail marks through the wrists, not the palms, which is anatomically correct for how Romans executed prisoners. A spear wound in the side, matching the Gospel account. Scourge marks across the back, consistent with a Roman flagrum. A whip embedded with bone and metal designed to tear flesh. In 1978, a team of scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project conducted the most comprehensive analysis ever done on the cloth. They used X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, and ultraviolet photography. They found blood, real human blood, not paint, not pigment. Hemoglobin, and when they tested it, the result was A positive. Then there's the Sudarium of Oviedo, a smaller cloth, roughly 33 by 21 inches, kept in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain. According to tradition, this was the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John, the cloth that was found in the tomb folded in a place by itself. It doesn't have an image like the shroud, but it has blood stains. Lots of them. Over 100 documented stains, splattered in patterns consistent with a person who died in an upright position, struggling to breathe. In 1999, Dr. Jose Delfin Bilalain Blanco, a professor of forensic medicine, tested the Sudarium. The blood type, AB positive, and the stains matched the shroud. The same blood group, the same pattern of trauma, the same forensic signature. If you overlay the Sudarium on the face of the shroud, the stains align. Perfectly. So now we have three objects. Lanciano in Italy, the shroud in Turin, the Sudarium in Spain. Separated by geography. Separated, allegedly, by time, but connected by a single biological thread. The blood type AB positive. The universal receiver. This is what forensic scientists call triangulation, when three independent data points converge on a single conclusion in a criminal investigation. If you have three witnesses who don't know each other, and they all describe the same suspect, you pay attention if you have three crime scenes with the same DNA. You're looking for one person. That's not coincidence, that's a pattern. And the pattern here is undeniable. These are not random relics from random people. These are forensically connected. Same blood type, same tissue markers, same historical trauma. The question is whether this pattern is evidence of preservation or evidence of something else. Evidence of authenticity or evidence of coordination. Evidence of a man who walked the earth 2,000 years ago, or evidence of a mystery we are not equipped to solve. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about DNA, because if these are genuine human tissues, then they contain genetic material, chromosomes, the blueprint of identity. Every human cell, except for red blood cells, contains DNA, and DNA tells you everything. Who your parents were, what diseases you carry, what color your eyes are, your entire biological history, written in for chemical letters. In 1995, a geneticist named Dr. Lanciano Valdez claimed to have extracted DNA from the Shroud of Turin. He said the DNA was human, male, XY chromosomes. But here's where it gets strange. He also said the DNA was highly degraded, fragmented, and contaminated with genetic material from multiple sources. People who had handled the shroud. People who had prayed over it. Monks, priests, scientists, skeptics. All of them left biological traces. The shroud, like Lanciano, is a genetic palimpsest. A layered manuscript where the original text is obscured by centuries of additions. So testing the DNA is not straightforward. It's not like a crime scene where you swab a surface and get a clean result. This is ancient DNA, mixed with modern DNA, preserved in conditions that should have destroyed it centuries ago. But let's assume, for a moment, that you could isolate the original DNA. Let's assume you could separate the 8th century genetic material in Lanciano, or the 1st century material in the shroud, from all the contamination. What would you find? You would find XY chromosomes, male. That much is clear from the tissue analysis. The Lanciano flesh is myocardial tissue, heart muscle, which has been confirmed to be male. The shroud shows a male body. The Sudarium's bloodstains come from a male victim, so we know the sex. But here's the problem. Here's the question that no one wants to ask out loud. If this is human male tissue, then it has a Y chromosome. The Y chromosome comes from the father. It's the genetic signature of paternity. You inherit your X chromosome from your mother. But the Y, that comes from the man who contributed half of your DNA. Your biological father. So, if the DNA in these artifacts is from a man with no earthly father, as Christian theology claims, then where did the Y chromosome come from? This is not a question of faith. This is a question of genetics. You cannot have XY chromosomes without a biological father. It's a genetic impossibility. Unless the Y chromosome was created ex nihilo, out of nothing, by a mechanism that defies everything we know about reproduction. Unless the DNA itself is evidence of a virgin birth. Unless the science, rather than disproving the miracle, is actually confirming it in a way that we don't know how to interpret. Some researchers have speculated that the DNA might show only the X chromosome from the mother, with the Y chromosome being somehow different, somehow unique. But that's speculation. No one has published a peer-reviewed genetic analysis of the Lanciano flesh that maps the full chromosomal structure. And even if they did, even if they found something anomalous, how would you interpret it? How would you explain a Y chromosome that doesn't match any known human lineage? This is the edge of science, the place where the data stops making sense, where the evidence points to something that shouldn't exist. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're a detective and you're investigating a murder. You find DNA at the crime scene. You run it through every database. CODIS, Interpol, Ancestry, to 3andMe. Nothing. No match. No relatives. No genetic connection to any known human being. The DNA is human, but it's not in the tree. It's an orphan. A genetic ghost. How do you explain that? Do you conclude that the DNA is fake? Or do you conclude that you found someone whose lineage is not in your database? Someone whose father is not in the records? That's what we're dealing with here, a genetic orphan. Blood that matches 3 separate artifacts, spanning 3 centuries, connected to the same historical figure, but with no clear biological lineage, no family tree, no father in the records, just a Y. Chromosome that came from. Where? And here's the other problem. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that this is the blood of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's say the shroud, the sudarium, and the Lanciano flesh are all genuine relics, preserved by some mechanism we don't understand. If that's true, then his DNA should match. The genetic material in the Lanciano heart should be identical to the genetic material on the shroud. Same chromosomes, same markers, same person. But no one has done that test. No one has directly compared the DNA from all three artifacts in a controlled, peer-reviewed study. Why not? Is it because the Church is afraid of what they might find? Or is it because science is afraid? Because here's what that test could reveal. It could reveal that they don't match. That the Lanciano flesh is from a different person than the shroud. That these are three separate relics from three separate people who all happened to have AB positive blood. Which, given that AB positive is only 3% of the population, would be statistically unlikely but not impossible. Or it could reveal that they do match. That the DNA is identical. That you have three independent artifacts from three different locations, all containing genetic material from the same individual. A man who died 2,000 years ago, whose body was buried, and yet whose tissue has been preserved in three separate forms, in three separate places, with no decomposition. How do you explain that? How do you explain preservation that violates every known law of biology? You can embalm a body. You can mummify a body. You can freeze a body in ice. But you cannot keep living tissue, myocardial tissue, blood cells with intact nuclei preserved for centuries in a glass reliquary with no refrigeration, no chemicals, no intervention. It's not scientifically possible. And yet, the evidence says it happened. So we're left with two possibilities. Either the science is wrong, which is unlikely given that multiple independent labs have confirmed the findings, or the tissue is not behaving according to the laws of nature. It is an exception, an anomaly, a miracle. But science doesn't like miracles. Science likes patterns, laws, repeatability. Science likes explanations that fit within the framework of what we already know. And this doesn't fit. This is a data point that exists outside the model, a fact that contradicts the theory. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can dismiss the data as flawed, contaminated, or misinterpreted. Or you can adjust the theory, expand the model to include the anomaly. The problem is, expanding the model means accepting that there are phenomena in the universe that we cannot explain with our current understanding of biology, chemistry, and physics. It means admitting that there are gaps in our knowledge, holes in the fabric of reality where something else is operating, something that leaves physical evidence but defies natural law. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the purpose of these relics is not to prove anything. Maybe the purpose is to ask a question, to present evidence that doesn't resolve neatly, to create a mystery that forces you to think beyond the binary of belief and disbelief, to exist in the space of uncertainty, where the answer is not handed to you but has to be wrestled with. Because that's what these artifacts do. They give you data, but they don't give you conclusions. They give you blood type, tissue structure, forensic details, and then they leave you with a question. Who does this belong to? Where did the Y chromosome come from? Why has this tissue not decayed? And the answer is not in a lab report. The answer is in what you do with the question. Do you dismiss it? Do you ignore it? Or do you let it haunt you? Do you let it live in the back of your mind, a puzzle piece that doesn't fit, a mystery that refuses to be solved? 3 artifacts, 3 centuries, 1 blood, AB positive, the universal receiver, the blood that can accept life from anyone, the blood of the rarest 3% of humanity, the blood that appears in Lanciano, in Turin, in Oviedo, always in connection with the same story. The same wounds, the same death. Science has given us the data. The DNA is male. The blood type is AB positive. The tissue is myocardial, preserved against all odds. But science cannot tell us who this man was. Science cannot tell us where the Y chromosome came from. Science cannot tell us why 3 separate artifacts, separated by geography and allegedly by time, all contain the same genetic signature. That is not a failure of science. That is the limit of what science was designed to do. Science describes, it measures, it categorizes, but it does not and cannot explain everything. There are edges to the map, places where the data runs out and the mystery begins. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point is not to have all the answers. Maybe the point is to stand at the edge of what we know and look out into what we don't. To hold the evidence in your hands and admit that you don't understand it. To say, this is real. This is measurable. This is here. And I don't know what it means. Because that's where we are. We have tissue that should not exist. Blood that should not be preserved. DNA that should not be intact. And a pattern that connects 3 objects across time and space in a way that defies random chance. The question is no longer whether these artifacts are real. The question is what they're evidence of. Evidence of a man. Evidence of a miracle. Evidence of something else entirely. I don't have the answer. Neither does science. Neither does theology. The answer, if there is one, exists somewhere in the space between. In the tension between what we can measure and what we can understand. In the gap between the data and the interpretation. And maybe that's the most honest place to end. Not with a conclusion, but with a question. Not with certainty, but with wonder. Because the universe is full of mysteries. And some of them leave evidence. Physical, measurable, undeniable evidence. Evidence that says something happened here. Something that doesn't fit. 3 artifacts, 3 centuries, 1 blood. Science has found a man with no biological father. What you do with that information is up to you.